tendency that we all have sort of noticed when we see a team piling on with some frantic late game flurries when they're down and they need to tie it. It's something we see when Joffrey Lupul tells us that if only the Leafs could play in the first two periods like they did in the third period, then they'd be the best team in the league. So it's one of those concepts. It actually wasn't statistically proven to be a factor, or the extent to which it was a factor, until about 2009, when a guy by the name of Tor Purdy, or aka Jay Lickens online, did some of the proofs and figured out the exact way and the measure and the extent of this effect. And I believe Tyler Dello also did some work towards this, but I can't find proof of that since none of his work is online anymore. But you can see this chart, which kind of gives you a really good idea of how score effects apply to the NHL. And if you look at that shot share column in particular, you'll see the teams that are down 2 goals on average control 55.5% of the shot attempts, compared to, up 2 goals, only 44.5. And you can see this effect is actually very stark. These shots for and shots against columns are for an average NHL team over the course of a season. That's the number of shot attempts they'll get in each of those situations. So you can see that this is a pretty obvious effect. There's really, nothing to hide here. Teams that are down get more shots than teams that are up. So why do score effects exist? So I came up with a list of 5 reasons that I think encompass basically the reasons why it's a factor in our game. So the first is the leading coach making conservative decisions. So this is things like putting out their players who they trust the most defensively, players who they know aren't going to get fancy, maybe give the puck away in front of the net. And these also tend to be players who are further down in the lineup, guys who, aren't going to be able to produce goals necessarily. So the effect of that is that you're going to get less shots and you're going to allow more shots. Obviously, on the flip side of that, you have the trailing coach who's going to make aggressive decisions because they know they need to tie the game. So they're going to put out the riskier players, the guy with more offensive upside, the guys who may try that fancy play at the blue line, but who may not be as good defensively. And the result of those two things is going to be, obviously, the ice is going to be tilted one way. And then sort of in conjunction with that, you have leading players playing it safe. So that means guys knowing, if I make a mistake here, my coach is going to be really angry and is going to bench me. So I'm going to just chip the puck out of the zone rather than try and carry it out, and things like that. And then obviously number 4 is things like defensemen pinching in and, third player high, pressing down low, sending extra guys in, and making sure the puck stays in the zone above all else. So this is basically a 2-sided effect where you have one team that's playing a particular way and another team that's playing the opposite way. And then as a result, you have this very distinctive effect. And then I have a quote here from Barry Trotz, which kind of backs this up from earlier this year, where he's basically saying, when you're down, when you're up 4-2 in a game, you need to secure the game. You shouldn't be thinking about that 5th goal. You should only be thinking about playing defense and basically shutting down the game. And obviously there's a lot of, I'm not going to say controversy, but, people have different opinions as to whether that's an accurate statement. From the research that's been done, I think the consensus is probably that coaches generally play it a little bit too conservative in these kind of times, and that generally you maybe only when there's maybe 5 minutes a game left in the game does it actually make sense to play more conservatively and try and shut it down in the way that he's talking. So the 5th thing is loss aversion, and that's something that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation today. And loss aversion is essentially the idea that people hate to lose more than they like to win. And it's something that you don't talk about a lot when it comes to score effects. You talk about risk aversion, coaches not wanting to take risks, and you hear that a lot. But you don't necessarily hear that as much about loss aversion. So I'm going to bring back Daniel Kahneman here for a few more quotes because I think they're really interesting. And one of the things that Kahneman brings up in his book is an example where, let's say a guy comes up to you on the street and says, I have a coin here. I'll make a deal with you. Flip the coin. If it comes up heads, I'll give you $150. If it comes up tails, you give me $100. And you would think, this comes up net positive for you. You have a better chance of winning. Chances are your expected outcome is positive, put it that way. And yet most people would reject this deal. The average person is going to say, no, losing $100 means more to me than gaining $150, which is kind of a counterintuitive concept. But then if you think about your own tendencies in terms of losing and winning, it actually makes some sense. So he says the reason you like the idea of gaining $150 and dislike the idea of losing $100 is not that these amounts change your wealth. You just like winning and dislike losing, and you almost certainly dislike losing more than you like winning. When directly compared or weighted against each other, losses loom larger than gains. So on the bottom left here, I have a picture from Moneyball with Billy Beane saying, or Brad Pitt saying, I hate losing more than I even want to win. And then on the bottom right, this is a chart that's similar to one taken from Thinking Fast and Slow, where you can see that negative value as you lose actually compiles faster in your mind than positive value. So you're going to take your losses harder than you take your gains. So it's interesting when I thought about this, when I was reading Thinking Fast and Slow for the first time and thinking about score effects and thinking about some of the studies that have done, is I thought of these two questions. The first is, could the score of a playoff series alone affect the shot distribution in a particular game? And the second is, if so, is this only loss aversion at play, or are there other factors that cause these effects? Because in my mind, it's legitimately possible that players try harder while they're losing inherently than they do when they're winning. So I wanted to see whether this effect was possible. So what I did was I gathered, thanks to War on Ice and their amazing database, I gathered all of the playoff shot attempt differentials going back to 2002, 2003, and sorted them by the score of the series at the time of the game, and came up with this. So as you can see, the effect isn't huge, but you can see that there's a slight tendency that when teams are up in a series, they control less shot attempts, and when they're down in a series, they control more shot attempts. But of course, this is just sort of eyeballing, and I wanted to see whether this was statistically significant. So I looked at specifically just the Corsi for percentage when trailing compared to when tied, and I found that the average when you're trailing in a series in the playoffs is 50.76%, and the average when tied is obviously 50%. So I found a 95% confidence interval. For those who are statistically inclined will know what that means. And basically found that the confidence interval is just barely significant, to the extent that basically what that means is we're 95% confident that the true mean shot attempt differential for a team losing in a playoff series is between 50.01% and 51.51%, which essentially means that it seems like there's a very minor effect, but that there is an effect. But I wasn't entirely satisfied with that, because when you think about the way the playoffs works, good teams are going to have good shot attempt differentials, and good teams are going to win more games. So inherently, the better teams with the better shot attempt differentials are more often going to find themselves leading in series, and therefore the up numbers are going to be skewed for that reason. So to give an example, this was from last year's Stanley Cup Finals, Game 3 with LA up 2-0. The Rangers controlled 64% of the shot attempts in that game. And if you contrast that with their regular season numbers, you could find an adjusted Corsi for percentage in that game. The numbers don't exactly equal 100, but it's close. But essentially, the adjusted Corsi for percentage for the Rangers in that game was actually around 67%. So they get a slight edge because of that. So what I did was I compiled that for every game, and I ran these numbers again to see what I would find. And the answer was that the effect was even more blatant. You see that the teams that are down now are all above 50% in terms of their percentages. There might be some kind of sample size issue with the down 2 and down 3 that makes it that the down 2 is less of an advantage than down 3. I'm not totally sure what's going on there. But essentially, it really does seem like there's something going on here. And I took another 95% confidence interval. Obviously, you don't want to do that too many times. But I found here, obviously, that the effect is even more stark. So the interval now is between 50.52 and 51.94 that this effect exists. So the next question I had was, is this just loss aversion? Is this literally only the fact that players try harder when they're losing, or is there more to it at play? So my initial instinct would have been that it's probably mostly loss aversion, because I couldn't think of situations where a coach would necessarily change their strategies too much to start a game just because they were losing in a series, and I couldn't see a situation where players did that much differently. But then I saw this video, which kind of changed my mind a little bit.
Dave Tippett, coach of Phoenix. Had a chance to talk the day before the game. I got the sense in coach speak is that his team's going to be a little bit more aggressive against the Red Wings here, and a must-win for the Coyotes.
If we are to see more aggressiveness on the part of Phoenix, do we see it with just hits?
Well, I think it's more in the type of style, Dr. It's pretty evident there on that play where Keith Yaniel, defenseman, pinched in and went ahead and tried to keep that play alive by coming in from the blue line position. But if you're going to do that, you better have support in behind us. The defensemen have to look. You can't just run out of position. Make sure you have the support, but try to play 200 feet away from your goaltender.
So that kind of changed my mind a little bit on that idea. And obviously, it's an anecdotal piece of evidence, so it doesn't mean that much. But it at least gave me the idea that this might potentially be a situation where coaches actually play it differently, and as a result, players might play the situation differently as well, with a certain sense of urgency. So my conclusion there was that this is probably still largely loss aversion. I think there is a sense of that, but there might also be strategical factors at play in certain situations. So what are some potential problems with this? There's a couple of things that I'm not convinced are going to affect the numbers anyway, but will need to be taken into account in the future. The first is whether there's the effect of home ice on this type of stuff, because obviously when you're talking about the playoffs, there's a set sequence of home and away games. And I thought about this for a while, and I couldn't think of any reason why this would particularly affect the numbers, but it's something to think about a little more. And the second thing is I only use raw shot attempt numbers. I didn't use score adjusted numbers. So there's the potential that in-game score effects could have some kind of impact on this. So that's another thing to examine. And then obviously a big future question for this then is, if we know that these results have an impact on the team level, do they also have an impact on the player level? And could we then sort of adjust our numbers for the playoffs to facilitate this? So what are some practical applications for this? The first is just simply evaluating performance in the playoffs more fairly. Obviously, it's already a very small sample size, and you want to make sure you're as accurate as possible. So if we know that this is an effect that exists, how can we series score adjust our numbers to make sure that we take this into account? The second is a coaching tool used to incite desperation when leading. So if you're a coach going into a game up 3-2 in a series, and that other team's really going to come out hard, and you have now data to prove it, you can maybe find a way to use that to motivate your team to try and come out with that same desperation somehow. And then finally, just a key to better understanding the cause of score effects. I think that loss aversion is generally sort of dismissed when it comes to figuring out what really causes score effects. It's always the more strategic side of the game that we talk about. But, this kind of lends us the belief that potentially there's a lot more going on than just, the players that are put out on the ice and the way they play because of what they're afraid of. So I think this lends us some expertise on that as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Is the next one queued up?
Yeah, it's that one. I think that PowerPoint